Good day and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating the Changing Landscapes of Wealth and Philanthropy. This webinar is being recorded. If you have a question at any time, please enter it into the Q&A panel. At this time, I would like to turn the call over to Carrie Abitbol. Go ahead, Carrie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. As mentioned, you're here for the webinar, Navigating the Changing Landscapes of Wealth and Philanthropy. My name is Carrie, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. I'm in the marketing department at Lexisnexis, sponsor of today's webinar. As you can see, Lexisnexis is an industry leader providing information professionals with access to premium news, business, and legal content. More than 90% of Fortune 500 companies rely on Lexisnexis to guide them toward informed, fact-based decisions and strategies. I'm joined today by our two panelists from the Helen Group, a leading prospect research consultancy that many of you on the call may be familiar with. First, we have Elizabeth Roma, Assistant Director of Research with the Helen Group. Since joining the Helen Group in 2008, she's worked with a variety of nonprofit organizations in the biomedicine, arts and culture, education, and human and social services industries. Elizabeth began her prospect development career at the University of Pennsylvania in 1998 and later joined the Boston College Prospect Research staff. She's a member of APRA International and is President-elect of APRA Carolinas. Next, we have Rachel Dakarian, Research Associate with the Helen Group. Before joining the Helen Group, she served as a prospect research analyst for her alma mater, Drake University. She also worked on the development research staff at the Iowa State University Foundation. Rachel is a member of APRA and serves on the board of the Great Plains chapter. You can find more detailed information about our panelists on their LinkedIn pages, which you'll see on the slides, and be sure to follow them on Twitter as well. As for the format of today's webinar, Elizabeth and Rachel will present key insights about the current fundraising climate and how to capitalize your efforts accordingly. We'll then open it up to a Q&A with the panelists. Please submit your questions to the host and presenter through the chat box on the right-hand panel of your screen. I'll read your questions, and unless otherwise specified, direct them to one of our panelists. I'd also invite everyone to participate in our live poll, which is also on the right-hand side of your screen. Your feedback is really appreciated in guiding future webinar topics, as well as spotting additional questions and trends that our panelists may address today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rachel and Elizabeth to get us started.
Thanks, Carrie. This is Elizabeth, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Rachel and I have been excited about this webinar ever since we scheduled it over the summer, but we are especially excited because it's been a really big week in philanthropy. And so we obviously have no control over that, but we could not have planned the timing for this better. So I hope that you'll all have some good takeaways. What we want to do today is give you a chance to kind of breathe for an hour and think for an hour and get your head up from your desk and out of the nitty-gritty day-to-day work that you do with profile writing and report writing and living in your database. And we want to really step back and take a look at what's happening in philanthropy from a big picture perspective. We're going to discuss some specific examples from the world of philanthropy that we're going to use as illustrations of sort of some of the broader trends that we're seeing these days. And then we want to just plant some seeds in your brain to help you think about these trends and the way that they're playing out and impacting your own organization. And we want to really have you leave today feeling empowered to be a more strategic partner at your organization. So just some housekeeping to lay the groundwork for our discussion today. This is a definition of ultra-high net worth individuals. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about these individuals, and so we just want to make sure that we're clear about who we're discussing. Another thing, just to put this in perspective, we hear a lot of talk these days about the 1% in the United States, and when you hear the 1%, that typically refers to individuals who have a net worth of at least $18 million and up. So when we're talking about ultra-high net worth individuals, we're talking about people who have investable assets of at least $30 million. So that's even a pretty small subset of the 1%. So it's really a pretty thin slice of the pie that we're talking about today.
And we want to acknowledge that you may have, one or, if you're lucky, a handful of these people in your prospect pool. And if you're one of the lucky few that has a whole portfolio of these folks in your leadership or principal giving pool. Either way, we want you to be aware of them because they're wielding influence in the philanthropic world, and part of understanding and appreciating these trends that we're going to be discussing today is understanding that these folks are the thought leaders, and they're providing a majority of the framework for the future of philanthropy.
So two of the big things that we're seeing in philanthropy today, and these are sort of buzzwords that get tossed around, are megagifts and philanthrocapitalism. And for our purposes here, we're defining megagifts as donations of $50 million and up. This is something that's definitely on the rise. According to the Chronicle of Philanthropy, there were 19 gifts of $100 million or more in 2015. We'll go into this in a little more depth as we get further into the presentation, but we've seen 3 this week. So this is big, and it's something that Rachel and I personally find fascinating. And so we want to just talk about what does this mean for all of our organizations, whether we're soliciting these gifts or whether you're at a very small organization that is not likely to be soliciting gifts at this level. It still is something that's just sort of out there in the ether, and it's going to have an impact on the way that we all work. The image that you see on the slide is the cover of a book called Philanthrocapitalism, which was published in 2008. And it's talking about a change that we're seeing in the world today where the traditional boundaries between commerce and philanthropy are starting to break down, and that donors are seeing less of a strict division between what they're doing as business people and what they're doing as philanthropists, and also where they're putting their money. So you'll see that some philanthropists look at investments in companies very much in the same way that they look at their charitable contributions. And I would argue that for some people, they're also starting to lump political giving into that. So that instead of being sort of these separate buckets, they see all of those different activities as contributing to a common goal.
Absolutely.
A quote that I think illustrates this, sorry, Rachel, very well is, it comes from the letter that Steve and Jean Case wrote when they joined the Giving Pledge, and I'm just going to read you a brief section of it. But all of the Giving Pledge letters are really interesting to read, and I think it's a great way to get some insight into how these people at the very top levels are thinking about their philanthropy. So in their letter, the Cases wrote, "While there is often a defined division between for-profit and not-for-profit sectors, with for-profit focused on making money and not-for-profit focused on making a difference, our experiences suggest that can be an overly simplistic way of looking at the world." And so they're really looking at approaching their wealth very holistically and looking to make a difference in any way that they can, whether it's through for-profit endeavors or not-for-profit.
Another great quote that dovetails with Steve and Jean Case really well is on the Ben and Catherine Ivey Foundation website. Catherine had wrote, quote, "Ben and I had hoped we could use the business principles and strategies learned in our careers to make a philanthropic impact. As it turns out, our financial planning backgrounds have great application within the Ivey Foundation and the way we fund research. While we provide funding for research, we do not give gifts. We view our funding efforts as an investment in a research partnership with an expected rate of return measured by milestones and results." So Elizabeth and I were chewing over this quote just because I think it hits home on a major point regarding the terminology of this new philanthropic reality. We can't accurately predict how far we'll move away from using the term gift. That's probably going to be dependent on institutions and their specific donors. But you're going to see the term investment used more and more often. Those mega gifts we teased earlier at the top of the presentation that we'll discuss in a little bit also follow this trend. Not talking about necessarily philanthropy in terms of giving or gifting, but in terms of investing and being a partner, a business partner really. So at this point, both Elizabeth and I feel safe in terms of talking about this change in terminology as a transition, a bleed, an infiltration, if you will, between the financial sector or the for-profit sector and nonprofits. And resisting that transition or that full-blown change, if you will, I think isn't going to be helpful. You just need to know whether or not the particular donor or donors that you're talking to or looking to cultivate respond to the older terminology and they like thinking of their philanthropy as gift giving, or if they're a part of this new wave of folks that like thinking of their giving as investments and in return want to have both data and experiences that reflect ROI.
Absolutely, and I think one reflection of that is that there's definitely an increased interest in funding research and even in funding projects or organizations that might be viewed as being a little bit risky and being different from what's happened before. And there's less of an interest among some donors, but I think it's a sizable crowd, that there's less interest in more traditional types of philanthropy, so in making gifts for buildings or even for endowments in many cases, and naming gifts, which is not to say that donors don't want their name attached to their giving, because I think in many cases they still do, but they're interested in doing more than just attaching their name to a building. They really want to see some tangible results from the work that they're funding, and they really do think of themselves as partners. So along with that comes a desire for more active input in many cases.
So there's actually a really great article that was published on Huffington Post by John Kabara. He's the EVP and COO of the California Community Foundation, which is in LA. And also keep in mind any articles that we mention where there isn't a hyperlink or information available in these slides to sort of encourage you to follow both Elizabeth and I on Twitter. We'll be tweeting those out later, so that's a little aside for you. But in this article, which he titled The New Normal, Mega Donors and Fewer Recipients, he talked about how at the time, I believe this was November, sometime in the fall of 2015, so we're almost rounding out a year now. But at that time, Giving USA had just released an annual report on American philanthropy, and they mentioned a 5.4% rise in charitable giving, which was finally for the first time above recession levels. And while that's good news, it was directly a reflection of the economy. These bigger gifts, these mega gifts from fewer people, again reflecting the 1% issue that we were talking about. There's a 1% in philanthropy now too, as there would be. The way that nonprofits can combat this by maintaining their relevancy is by understanding, quote, the persistent needs that have not been addressed by the private or the public sectors, end quote. So he counsels that it's vital for nonprofits to recognize these needs and address the capabilities of your own organization to meet them. And that's why Elizabeth and I really want to drive home that you need to be a strategic partner in crafting your organization's goals, regardless of whether you're in the research shop like we are, if you're a frontline fundraiser, or if it's quite easy for you to direct campaign goals because you happen to be the VP or in the C-suite of your organization. If you're a strategic partner in crafting these goals, you're not only going to be able to engage donors in a way that's framed by your organization's future, what your vision is for the organization, but you're also going to be able to find new donors because you're speaking their language and you're appealing to them because you are aware of these trends in philanthropy, and so you can hopefully catch some new fish.
Yes, definitely. If you would move to the next slide, we want to talk about a specific group, which is the sort of the tech titans of the world and the very young, very wealthy Silicon Valley crowd. Sean Parker has sort of designated himself as a spokesperson for this crowd by writing an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal last summer, which he called Philanthropy for Hackers. And in that, it was sort of his personal manifesto for how he approaches philanthropy, but also he was arguing that this is sort of how his cohort approaches philanthropy. It's a fascinating view into how that crowd views themselves and how they're looking at the world of philanthropy. And he comes out kind of swinging a little bit at the traditional world of philanthropy. So I would definitely encourage you to, if you have not already read this column, to read it and just give yourself some time to think about it. He emphasizes the fact that this is a group who says, he says they have no elitist aspirations. So they're not interested necessarily in the clout that might come with being on the board or being a top donor to an organization. They're really interested in focusing on specific problems, and they really feel that they have the capacity to solve these problems through their expertise in technology, but also just through the financial muscle that they can put behind it. And he argues that the same characteristics that have allowed them to be successful entrepreneurs are the characteristics that drive their philanthropy. And so he highlights their idealism and their optimism and their faith in data. And this is a common theme that we see in a lot of these mega gifts, particularly from the tech crowd, that they view the problems of the world essentially as engineering problems, and that if we can harness the data and analyze it effectively, the solutions are at our fingertips.
Elizabeth and I love this op-ed because of the fact that it is essentially a manifesto for this new trend in philanthropy. Even though not everybody who is going to be donating in the future is necessarily going to consider themselves a hacker, we bring this up because we want folks to understand there has been a transition from believing in institutions to believing in innovation. And that monumental shift, as Mr. Parker points out himself, is a direct result of this particular global wealth, the global elite, and where they made their money, where this capital came from in the first place. They were successful in business and have a true belief, almost to a religious level, that the same principles can be translated seamlessly into philanthropy.
Absolutely. And one thing that is interesting to me about this group is that there's a tremendous amount of arrogance there. You know, for 30-somethings to come out and say, we have this money, we have this technological expertise, we can fix these problems that have been plaguing the world, you know, since the beginning of time. It's a pretty arrogant statement. But what I love about it is they are so optimistic and they really genuinely believe this. And I think that that is something that whether your donors are billionaires or not, that's a feeling that there's some momentum behind right now. And so that's spreading, I think, through their generation and also the generations above and below them. And because they are willing to put such large amounts of their own money into tackling some of these problems that have really been intractable, I think it's building a lot of momentum for smaller donations too. And there's a lot of excitement around some of these issues that the tech world has decided to take on. Now, the downside of that is that to some extent, they're driving the agenda for all of us. And so that's something that has opened them up to a lot of criticism. And I think it's a healthy discussion just in philanthropy to talk about and to make sure that important issues aren't getting neglected when there is such a large amount of money being controlled by such a small amount of people. It's important to have a voice for some of the lesser causes. And that's where project researchers and development staff in particular, I think, can be really helpful in helping your organization craft its message. So we can go ahead and move to the next slide, Carrie. We're sort of talking about some of this, we've started talking about some of this already. There is a considerable amount of backlash to these mega gifts. And I think that that's perfectly understandable and perfectly natural given the concentration of wealth at the very top that we're seeing. Another thing that's opening the door to some of that is that the vehicles that a lot of these people are using are not the traditional philanthropic vehicles. So the classic example of this is the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which they announced in conjunction with the birth of their daughter Max. And they announced that they plan to give away 99% of their Facebook stock, which at the time that they announced the donation was worth an estimated $45 billion. But rather than putting it into a foundation, they created an LLC. And they were pretty explicit at the time of the announcement that the reason that they did that was to allow themselves more flexibility in the type of gifts that they could make, or in the type of funding that they could make. So that they could make straight philanthropic gifts, but also that they could invest in for-profit companies and possibly political donations. And this is something that we're seeing not just with Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, but with other members of this cohort too. A great example is recently Justin Moskowitz, who's another Facebook founder, and his wife Carrie Tuna announced that they were going to give $20 million to help elect Democrats in this election cycle. And I think that that gift is really interesting because they even said in announcing the gift that they were uncomfortable with anyone using large amounts of money to influence elections. So they even recognized in making the gift, so this is something that's a little uncharted and probably unfair, but they also said that they felt so compelled by what's at stake in this election, and particularly by the rhetoric that the Trump campaign has been putting out, that they felt like they had to do something and had to take action.
And political giving is extremely important in terms of understanding somebody's philanthropic propensity. Blackbaud recently released a very interesting study on political giving and charitable giving, specifically the influence of political giving on folks' donations. And they were looking at 2012 specifically in terms of finding a framework for looking at 2016. And of their key findings, we thought it was extremely interesting that donors who gave to federal political campaigns in 2012 gave 0.9% more to the charitable organizations that were also studied in 2012 as opposed to the year before. And donors who did not give to political campaigns reduced their giving to charities by 2.1%. So even though those percentages may seem small, it's absolutely an incentive to go out and look at which of your donors are giving to political campaigns, whether or not they are speaking through this giving, because particularly in Opposed Citizens United, so much of this political giving is political speech and can help you learn a lot about them. But there's also this new perception of political giving being impactful in the same way that one's philanthropy is. There are still obviously contribution levels and there are ceilings that you hit unless you happen to be an individual who is able to start up your own super PAC. But if you're not looking closely at your donors' political giving, I think you're missing a critical data point.
I agree, and I would also add to that, that if you are looking for new prospects, or if you've just done a screening, for instance, that's a group that I would look at pretty close to the front. If you're trying to find people, if you run a list of political donors, especially if you cut it off at so Donor Search, for instance, found that if individuals have given at least $2,500 lifetime, then they're 14 times more likely to make a philanthropic donation. So that's a great group to look at. And that might lead you to people who maybe don't have any evidence yet of major gift giving, but they're great major gift prospects, or at least potentially could be great major gift prospects. So even though it's a small dollar amount, it's a huge indication, and it's something that you definitely don't want to overlook. So we've talked some about the backlash that comes along with some of these big gifts. I also want to spend some time looking at the positive side, because I think there is a big positive side to it. And one of the things that's really fascinating to me about these gifts is that oftentimes they are going to work that the government would not support because it's viewed as too risky for the government. But a lot of these philanthropists, particularly philanthropists who have some risk involved in their industry, so either if they're entrepreneurs who have taken risks by funding their companies, or they're investors who are constantly assessing risk, those people tend to be a little more comfortable with taking on risk in their philanthropy too. And so they're not necessarily afraid to make big bets in their philanthropy, and they also tend to view philanthropy as a more iterative process. So even if the project that they're funding doesn't work exactly the way they thought that it was going to work at the outset, if they feel like there is, if they feel like it can advance the cause, so if there's a good lesson that can be learned from the failure, they're generally speaking okay with that. And I think that that opens up a lot of doors for our organizations and for the kinds of work that we can do. And there are some good examples of this. For example, the MacArthur Foundation issued a $100 million competition that's looking for proposals for work that can help solve a critical social problem. So that's a pretty broad category. And it's designed so that there's one winner. So the winning proposal will receive a grant of $100 million to do whatever work is in their proposal to solve the social problem of their choice. But the other thing that's really interesting about that is that the contest is structured so that the semifinalists who don't receive the ultimate $100 million prize will still receive help from an expert team that MacArthur will put together to help refine their proposals in the hope that they can find another person to fund it. So MacArthur is saying, look, we're going to fund one proposal, but we also really want to work to advance these other proposals and hopefully get them in the best possible shape that they can be in so that they'll attract another donor. So they're really looking to spur some other philanthropy as an outgrowth of this too.
That example also really hits on the trend of collaboration that we've sort of been hovering around throughout this presentation. Collaboration both internally within your organization, for a very long, for a long time now, I would say gifts that are interdisciplinary or help move your organization forward in some way have been really easy to hook donors because they want to make sure that they are helping your organization stay dynamic and nimble and all those other great buzzwords. But being collaborative could be the key to not only continuing to fundraise at the level that you are currently, but ensuring the future of your organization. One of the leading thought leaders in our sector, Jeffrey Walker, recently published an article to LinkedIn where he talks about transitional philanthropy, which is this radical shift from traditional philanthropy at this point, from a previous century ago, and the 21st century form of philanthropy using leveraged funding to support innovative ideas, systems, and technologies for integration into larger social systems. And this potential to help drive large-scale systemic change, precisely why the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative was created, is what is needed, in his and many others' opinions, to, quote, reform healthcare, education, and other social problems that, as you can see, we have this great quote up on our slide, the U.S. government or governments in general are either not able or unwilling to address. That sort of staggering quote that we have up about the government spending less on aid to the world poor than the average, than American consumers spend on candy. And so at this point, there's not only an activism in terms of political giving and wielding influence there, but also this idea that, well, we're just going to do it for ourselves. And what other reason do nonprofits, does the third sector exist if not to address these large-scale problems? And if you are able to take this idea of transitional collaborative philanthropy to your development shop, to your advancement team, we're quite confident that in whatever way makes sense according to your mission, you're not only going to be able to energize donors, but find new prospects for yourself.
And there's such an opportunity here for organizations that are working in the social arena. Historically, most of these large gifts that we're talking about have gone to sort of the old guard of nonprofit organizations. So, for instance, in 2015, of those $1,900 million gifts, 17 of them went to universities, medical centers, or large cultural institutions like museums. But a resource that I would love to point you to, and this is not just for people working in the social sector, but for everyone, is the Bridgespan Group, which is a sort of a consultancy for nonprofit organizations and also philanthropists and helping both sides work more closely together. They have done a report that they called, I think it's called $1 Billion Bets for Economic Opportunity, where they looked at the potential for change that a $1 billion investment could make in areas like early childhood development or reducing unwanted pregnancies, decreasing rates of incarceration, sort of large social problems like that. And one of the things that they found in this study, and it's a fascinating study, I would encourage you to read it, and I will tweet out the link after this, but they found in the study that 80% of the largest donors, when interviewed, say that they aspire to impel social change. But when you look at the gifts, just 20% of gifts of $10 million or higher went to social change organizations between 2000 and 2012. So the conclusion that Bridgespan drew was that philanthropists have lacked the sight lines into shovel-ready projects, and they've lacked the confidence that large investments would actually impact the economic lives of many people. And so they conducted this report to create a tool that social organizations working towards social change can use to help craft their message. So it's a great report, and I would definitely encourage you to check it out because they have some tangible results that show, you know, what $1 billion in this field could accomplish.
And in case crafting the message sounds like it's very much tied to discovery and cultivation in the donor cycle, I think it's very important to point out that this, quote, Silicon Valley way of philanthropy that we've been discussing also demands more control, and there's a hands-on formula there that speaks to the way we need to steward our donors. And we need to either look into creating more robust stewardship reports or potentially really overhauling and breathing new life and getting some fresh blood into our stewardship programs in general, because we all know those folks that were one-and-done givers, and, you know, we don't want anybody to be staying awake at night thinking about whether or not they could have done something more to ensure that there was longevity with this particular donor. And in this new philanthropic reality that Elizabeth and I hope we are not only articulating for you, but are going to help you navigate it, that's going to be such a critical piece because, as we all know, current donors and potential donors talk to each other, and the reputations of our organizations precede us. And so if we are either not in a position to be able to secure these mega gifts or are currently not aware of some of these high net worth or ultra high net worth individuals that we have within our donor pool, one of the ways we can shine a light and put a spotlight on ourselves is by emphasizing the control and collaboration that we provide our donors, and also emphasize the fact that this is now more than ever a two-way street. Soliciting a gift isn't just, here's this project that we have, we would love your support, but what do you want to see this institution do? In what way can you essentially, in the same way that you have peer screenings, right, can you not only talk to other organizations that are similar to yours and find opportunities to collaborate, but also get particular pools of your donors talking to you and talking to each other to be able to create a conversation and start a dialogue about how you're going to be able to move your organization into this transitional as opposed to traditional philanthropy.
And to the extent that you can build that into the relationship, you as a prospect researcher can build that into the relationship from the very beginning, you're going to help your gift officers so much if you can go to them when you identify a new prospect, if you can not only give them, the financial background, but also help them have a little bit of insight into that person's thinking, either through what you've observed, learning about their approach to business, or if you read personal interviews, or if you just see what their group of friends is like, or if you can identify connections to other donors in your database. All of that is going to help your gift officer make a stronger connection and also be able to make a stronger case for your organization. So instead of just presenting a new prospect and saying, look, this person went to our school and I think they could make $1 million gift, call them. If you can add to that, this person went to our school and they are a graduate of the engineering school. They're working in data science right now, and I think they might be really excited about this new professor who we've brought in to teach data science. And by the way, they also live in the same neighborhood as one of the people who sits on the board of overseers at the engineering school. Things like that, which this is not new information for prospect research, but I think it's becoming more and more critical to be able to make that connection quickly with donors, because there's just so much more demand for their attention and time that we really need to do our homework and have that information at the ready the first time we present those prospects to our gift officers.
All right, so if we could go to the next slide, we can finally get into these very recent, as in yesterday, brand new gifts that Elizabeth and I have been teasing for the entire presentation. So these crazy diamonds, as this Economist article calls them, are these billionaires who are the force behind these mega gifts.
I don't know where all of you were yesterday afternoon, but I can tell you that Rachel and I and many of our HBG colleagues were glued to our screens watching the Facebook Live video of Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan announcing that they are planning to commit $3 billion over the next 10 years to
billion with a B, as
billion
in boy.
with a B, right? To, in their words, cure, prevent, or manage all disease within our children's lifetime. So that's amazing. That's amazing that these two individuals are taking this on. It's fascinating to me for many, many reasons, but a couple of things that jumped out at me, and if you have not watched the announcement, I would encourage you to watch it because, for one thing, I think it's a cornerstone moment of philanthropy, and it's absolutely, history making. And so definitely watch it for that, but also just to hear how they're talking about the work and how they're approaching it. One of the things that Priscilla Chan said when she first came on the stage was that she said, our mission is ambitious, which is the understatement of the century. She said that when they founded the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, their goal was to dramatically improve every life in Max's generation. So they're really looking at this as they have this incredible fortune, and they are making a very conscious effort to use it to solve what they look at as some of the world's biggest problems. And I think that their approach to that is really interesting. She talked about how they've spent the last 2 years traveling around and meeting with different scientists to learn all that they can about sort of this current state of medical research. And then a critical piece of what they want to do is to apply technology to the world of medical research. And they feel, again, this is coming from his background in the tech world. She has a medical background. She's trained as a medical doctor. So I think that's a really interesting intersection too. But they really have taken this on as a full-time job, and they've spent a tremendous amount of time traveling around and meeting with people to educate themselves. And they've put together a team of experts who they want to work on this project with them. And again, that's something that I think is becoming more and more common, especially with these younger philanthropists who are new to the world of enormous wealth and philanthropy, that they really do look to experts in the field to advise them on their philanthropy. So there is this arrogance behind it in that, you know, we have the capability to solve these huge problems, but they recognize that they don't necessarily have the expertise needed. And so they're leaning pretty heavily on putting together teams of experts to advise them.
Well, and to also really hit home our point that this is a cornerstone or a watershed moment, Bill Gates, he himself and his wife being sort of the driving force behind the Giving Pledge, he took the stage after Mark spoke to not only emphasize the important role of science in our future, our children's future, ensuring that we're able to tackle sort of these great challenges of our time, but there's also some really interesting specific aspects of this gift. Going back to our comment about faith in innovation as opposed to institutions, part of this $3 billion gift will be $600 million, a mega gift in and of itself. $600 million, an investment, quote, that word used exactly, in BioHub, a new physical location that will be in San Francisco's Mission Bay district to unite researchers from Stanford, Berkeley, UCSF, and new, quote, elite engineers to find ways to treat disease. So note, it's not $600 million specifically to Stanford or Berkeley, but it's providing a space for collaboration. It's not as if there is an idea that the star, the top of the heap institution is going to have a corner on the market, if you will, in terms of the talent and the resources to be able to crack this themselves. It's all about bringing together a team of the best so that together they can collaborate and find a way to, quote, cure, prevent, or manage all disease, end quote, as Chan Zuckerberg science, which is what they're calling this $3 billion investment, so that Chan Zuckerberg science can be successful. The other major gift that dropped, oh, sorry, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I was just going to add to that, I think that's a common theme, is that the allegiance is not to a specific organization, but it's really a commitment to solving a problem, and they're looking at whoever is best able to solve that problem, rather than first deciding what organization they support and then fitting their philanthropy into the work of that organization. It goes the other way. But yes, the other big gift, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, if that didn't whet your appetite, George Soros yesterday announced that he's investing $500 million to help refugees, quote, in ways governments cannot. Again, talking about these gifts as investments in his press release, he said, all of the investments we make will be owned by my nonprofit organization. So his nonprofit, but talking about this $500 million as an investment. These investments, quote, are intended to be successful because I want to show how private capital can play a constructive role helping migrants, and any profit will go to fund programs at the Open Society Foundations, including programs that benefit migrants and refugees. He describes this collective failure of policies to handle increased migration and the concerns and needs and crises that come along with refugee status and these refugee populations. So this thing just, you know, sort of our brains were on fire when this gift was announced, not only because of the size of it, but using the term investment, and also framing it in such a way that Soros was incentivized to make this gift because he understands the government is unable to respond in a way that would actually be impactful.
And that's a theme across many of these too. So in addition to the Zuckerberg-Chan gift, another big one that was announced this week is Michael Bloomberg announced a gift of $300 million to Johns Hopkins for work in public health. And he cited problems like opioid addiction and gun violence. You're probably familiar that he's put a lot of funding over the years into fighting tobacco use. And there are other gifts, like Sean Parker has recently given $250 million for cancer research, which again, much like the Chan Zuckerberg gift, is not limited to one organization, but he's built a consortium of, I think there are 6 organizations involved. Phil Knight has given $500 million to Oregon Health and Science University for cancer research. And these are areas that traditionally have received a lot of government funding, but organizations are really seeing that government funding for this type of work is flat or even declining. And so they're really looking to philanthropy to step in and fill some of those gaps. And it's happening, which I think is wonderful. And for those of you who are thinking, I have no billionaires in my donor pool, I'm never going to get a gift like this, my annual fund is really pulling me through, I would just encourage you with the fact that Michael Bloomberg made his first gift to Johns Hopkins in 1965. He graduated in 1964, and he made his first gift to the university in 1965, and the gift was $5. And now, many years later, his gifts total $1.5 billion. So while most of us are not going to have a donor like that, the point is just don't overlook your low-level donors, because you never know what's happening in the future. And so it's important to start building that relationship as early as possible. So we have just a few more minutes left, and I want to definitely leave room for questions if we have any. So if you have questions, you can type them into the chat.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both. Was there anything else you wanted to address in your presentation? Because we do have a number of questions I'd love to get to, but want to make sure that you're wrapped on your end.
Yeah, I think we're good, because I don't want to cut off question time.
Okay, great. Well, we'll just get right into it then. First question for either Rachel or Elizabeth. How would you answer a gift officer who believes that the largest gift can best be secured via capital campaigns or named structures? There's a lot of data, but many gift officers feel that they know their donors.
Sure. And at the end of the day, it is always very important to be able to trust that one-on-one relationship that your gift officer has. But I think a major part of that is also acknowledging that they could be losing the forest for the trees. And the opinion or propensity of any one particular donor does not a campaign strategy make. And while we're not necessarily saying, you know, sorry, the winds of fortune are not with you, you can't build that new STEM facility, what we're saying is make sure that you choose a framework and are essentially, we don't like talking about fundraising in terms of sales, but pitch your current initiative, your current campaign in such a way that you are responsive to all of these trends that we've just talked about. So on a more practical level, I think you could go to this particular gift officer and maybe have a conversation about what it is that makes them anxious if you move away from this model that, you know, makes them feel like they can be successful, and let them know that not only are you going to be able to create a model as a result of the screening or whatever sort of prep work it is you want to do before you launch this campaign, but that you aren't just sending them out into the dark frontier hoping they don't fall off the edge of the world. You're going to be giving them, on a macro level, not only a portrait of a snapshot really of what your donor pool looks like, but that you're also going to be highlighting these specific donors that you think sort of are going to be on the cutting edge for you, that are going to find a particular level of appeal and excitement by this innovative and collaborative way that you're trying to move your organization's mission forward.
It's also something to think about, I think, when you're looking at portfolios and assigning prospects to certain gift officers. So, you know, we're talking about all of these new things that are happening and new changes that we're seeing, and I think that's true. But we don't mean to say no one's ever going to give you money for a building again, or, you know, don't do any more capital campaigns, because I think those things, you're still going to need building projects, and, you know, there's still going to be a need for campaigns. So we don't mean to suggest that that type of work is going to disappear altogether, but just that the focus maybe, that doesn't need to be the crux of every fundraising program forever, and that, you know, there is beginning to be a movement away from that. But if you do have gift officers who are, you know, very uncomfortable moving outside of that framework, probably you also have prospects who are very uncomfortable about moving out of that framework. And so it might just be something that you need to think about in terms of who are the best gift officers to approach which prospects. And so that's something, again, that as a researcher, hopefully you can gain some insight into the way that the prospects you're looking at are approaching their philanthropy, and then match, you know, assign them to gift officers who are looking at things the same way.
Perfect, thank you. And before we get to the next question, just a reminder for everybody on the call to participate in our live poll, which is on the right-hand side of the screen. So the next question is, what is a good, short, quick definition of collaborative philanthropy?
Oh, quick and short. Love that.
That's so, what was hanging a little.
I think, so I love being the opposite of quick and short, clearly, but I think you can apply a definition that is split between, you know, sort of an internal definition and an external definition. And you really, this needs to come from your organization. I think collaborative philanthropy is very specific to a specific institution, and you can be collaborative internally, which, like we said earlier, could be about emphasizing interdisciplinary programs, opportunities, but then also ascertaining what organizations or businesses really you can collaborate with to the benefit of both of you.
And also, I think there's an increased collaboration among philanthropists too, and with people sort of forming groups of like-minded philanthropists who are interested in funding the same type of work. Another thing that really struck me in the Zuckerberg announcement yesterday was he talked about how they had relied a lot on advice from the Science Philanthropy Alliance, which is a group that was formed by, I can't remember off the top of my head, but 6 or 7 large foundations who are really focused on work in the area of science. So like the Moore Foundation was one, the Simons Foundation I think is part of it, and they have this, created the Science Philanthropy Alliance as a resource for other organizations that are interested in funding basic science research but don't feel like they necessarily have the know-how to evaluate how to do it effectively. And so people like Mark Zuckerberg or anyone else really who's interested in funding science can go to the Science Philanthropy Alliance and get advice from their experts, learn about what organizations are sort of at the forefront of this type of work, and really get expert advice to help them craft their own strategy. And so I think that's something that we're seeing more and more of. There are collaboratives like that in other areas too. I think there's one for education. There's one that I can't think of, but I think there's one for the social services too, and I just can't think of the name of it. But that kind of stuff seems to me to be cropping up more and more, and so I think there's more of just sort of a looking for sort of crowd-based solutions and advice, and I think that's something that's kind of new.
You know, it also occurs to me that this could just be the new way we're talking about being donor-centered, because collaborative, meaning, you know, a more equitable, in my opinion, relationship between donor and recipient, like we were discussing earlier, this is also about stepping up your donor stewardship campaign. I mean, we've mentioned tech a lot, but also high finance and the extreme wealth that is generated by that is driving this new trend of mega gifts and philanthrocapitalism. And translating from that particular sector, I think it's really helpful to look at these donor stewardship meetings and stewardship reports and put the same level of importance and gravity with them, behind them, that you have in terms of reporting out on an investment portfolio. And if you are going out and using this language to hopefully engage with more hedge fund managers or people in financial services, they're going to respond to that level of reporting, to that level of collaboration. Not only will they start telling you, here's the way I want the data presented, this is the most meaningful way of looking at the data to me, et cetera, but that responsiveness, that customer service really is going to benefit you and increase. I don't think it's controversial to say that that's going to affect donor retention.
I think that's true. Just to jump back for a second, the group that I was talking about, it's a funder collaborative called Blue Meridian, and they announced in February 2016 that they're planning to invest at least $1 billion in U.S. nonprofits working for disadvantaged children and youth. So if you're in that area, definitely check out their website. But I also throw it out there just as an example of the type of collaborative work that's going on. I was looking at the clock earlier and not at the slide, so if you wouldn't mind jumping back, I realize that we skipped over our last slide, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but I just don't want to overlook it because it's, I love this column, and I would encourage you all to read it. But I also think it's just it throws out a nice question to end on. And so they're pointing out that a lot of the backlash when the Chan Zuckerberg initiative was announced was that people kind of just didn't understand, and maybe still don't understand what this means, that they're doing all this so-called philanthropy, but it's not through a nonprofit organization, so what can this be? And I think it just underscores the fact that the definition of charitable giving, the definition by donors, is starting to change. And so it opens up a great question of, what is the future of, what does the future of philanthropy hold, and what can it be? And I think it's a great time to ask that question at all of our organizations.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. I'm conscious of time, so if you're able to answer this, hopefully in 30 seconds or so. Can you discuss some ways that a university foundation might use the Facebook Live tool?
Ooh. Well, I think I'm going to use my 30 seconds to say, when in doubt, follow the thought leaders, and in your own way, do exactly what the Chan Zuckerberg initiative just did. Make yourself available every time so step up the old school communications method of just dropping a press release, right? Any opportunity you have to not only have content experts that are a part of your faculty or staff provide their particular insights and add color to what the announcement is. And it doesn't necessarily have to be philanthropic. It can be about research or whatever it is your institution happens to be proud of that week. Just use it as an engagement point, and also potentially use it to highlight alums and donors and current students. I think the doors are wide open. It's just whatever your leadership is comfortable with right now, and hopefully what you can move them towards being comfortable with.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a great way to build buzz. So yesterday when the Zuckerberg announcement came, we all work from home, so this was virtual whispering in the halls, but there was just this collective whispering among HBG where everyone was like, are you on Facebook? Do you see it? They're announcing it right now, and it was really exciting. It was an exciting announcement anyway, but I think that just really the in the moment of it and sort of the viral nature of it made it even more exciting.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And with that, we've come to the end of today's webinar, and just another round of thanks for all of our participants and for your time and your thoughtful questions. Hopefully everyone's gained some valuable tips and strategies that you can apply in your day-to-day. And as a reminder, today's session has been recorded and will be emailed to everyone on the call if you'd like to revisit at a later time, or if you know of a colleague who may benefit from the recording. And a quick plug for those who are in the market for a prospect research or fundraising solution. I'd encourage you all to consider Lexisnexis for Development Professionals, which is an online fundraising research tool that encompasses news, company, and public records data all in one platform. If you'd like to learn more, please indicate your interest in our post-event survey and we'll put you in touch with a rep. And I hope you'll join us again for our future Lexisnexis webinars. Stay tuned for announcements about our upcoming events by following our biz blog, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.